Hi, I'm Pete Meyer, technical editor of Motor Age magazine. Relining disc or drum brakes is a service often performed by less experienced technicians. Sometimes this inexperience can result in customer complaints of noise, pulsation, or even improper brake feel. And it's not the younger technician's fault. They don't know what they don't know. Today we're going to try to change all that on this edition of The Trainer. First, start by pumping the brake pedal several times to bleed off any vacuum remaining in the booster and checking the feel of the brake pedal. Is it firm? Is it high? Often a pedal that has play, then firms up and holds, is an indication of improperly adjusted rear drum brakes. You can double check this by applying the parking brake in most cars. Excessive movement of the parking brake lever is another indication of improper adjustment. Now test for leakage in the system by applying light pressure to the brake pedal and holding it there. Does the pedal sink towards the floor? If so, suspect a leak, which can be external along any of the connections or internal to the master cylinder. Turn the ignition key to the run position to perform a key-on bulb test and make sure the lamps are working for the equipped brake systems, ABS, TCS, and the brake warning. Once you've made sure all the bulbs are working, start the car while holding pressure on the pedal. It should fall slightly towards the floor and get less firm as vacuum enters the booster. Of course, this does not apply to hydraulically assisted systems. On most of those models, you'll feel a pop in the pedal as the system pressurizes. Place the car in gear and again lightly hold pressure on the pedal. Does the car try to creep away as the pedal effort fades? Another indication of pressure and/or fluid loss you will need to document and take a closer look at. Once you're confident in the basic integrity of the brakes, take it around the block. Listen for any abnormal noises. Growling can come as a function of pad material or from new pads that aren't properly seated. Squealing can come from glazed pad surfaces, contact of the squealer with the rotor, or from pads that aren't being held properly in place by worn hardware. Grinding usually indicates metal-to-metal contact from pads that should have been replaced a long time ago. Once you have all the information you need, it's time to put it up on the lift. Remove all the wheels and inspect all the brakes, even if the complaint is only related to one axle. I'm not going to bore you with the basics today. Instead, let's focus on inspection and service techniques that will help you fix it right the first time. Of course, the caliper has to be removed to remove the rotor. But don't let the rotors hang by the hoses. You'll ruin them in the process, and that can lead to brake pull, or at the very least, rapid brake wear, as pressure in the lines cannot return to the master cylinder when the driver lets up off the pedal. Clean the dirt and dust off of the piston, boot, and all mating surfaces. Inspect the pads for abnormal wear. Pads worn more on the inner or piston side indicate a piston and/or seal that is binding and not retracting as it should. More wear on the outer side generally means the caliper itself is binding and not floating freely. For disc brakes, measure the rotor's thickness in several places to determine if it is serviceable. Check for obvious damage. Many OEMs will tell you that rotors do not need to be resurfaced unless there is grooving or a problem with pulsation. So use a dial indicator to check for lateral runout, even if your test drive uncovered no pulsation in the pedal. If all the specs are good, leave the rotors alone. If not, index the rotors to the hub before removal, resurface the rotors, and then finish with a sanding block and 200 grit paper to leave a non-directional surface for the new pads to seat into. Thoroughly clean the machine rotor with hot soapy water to remove the fine machine particles left behind by the brake lathe. Returning the piston into its bore generates a lot of line pressure in the system that can force small debris into delicate components like the ABS control unit. Be sure to use a tool designed for the purpose and crack the bleed screw before forcing the piston in. Carefully peel back the dust boot to see if there's any contamination on the piston that could lead to seal damage or failure. I always recommend replacing the caliper hardware when servicing the brakes. These components ensure that the caliper moves freely and that the pads are held in the proper position. One cause of pad squeal is movement of the pad in the caliper, and that is controlled by the anti-rattle hardware. If the pads have no adhesive on their backing, apply a small coat of high-temperature silicone grease to them and to the areas where the pad rides in the mount. Torque everything to spec, paying close attention to hose routing. Reinstall the wheel and torque that to spec as well. The last step is another test drive. Two things to accomplish here. First, you want to seat in new pads to the rotors by making several hard stops from 35 miles an hour or so. And second, to make sure this job is done and the customer's original complaints are solved. To recap, take the time to test drive any car with a brake-related complaint. Follow the tips and techniques we've shared with you today in addition to following basic brake service procedures, and watch your comebacks disappear. That'll do it for this edition of The Trainer. I'm Pete Meyer.